The inheritance from a stranger. I was sitting in my kitchen with my morning coffee when the mailman delivered an envelope that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. A thick package with the seal of an elite law firm from downtown. I'm 58 years old, worked as a nurse my entire life at a regular hospital, and I'd never had any business with expensive lawyers. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The first lines of the letter made me reread the text 5 times in a row. I was the sole heir to the estate of the late Robert Collins. The inheritance amount, $5 million, plus a construction company, plus a mansion in a prestigious neighborhood. Robert Collins. That name meant absolutely nothing to me. I could have sworn I'd never heard it before. The letter contained my full name, date of birth, address, social security number. Every detail was flawlessly accurate. $5 million, an amount I couldn't even dream of. More than I would have earned in 10 lifetimes. From a man I supposedly never met. My first instinct told me this was fraud, an elaborate scam that had somehow gotten hold of my personal information. But the seal was real, the paper expensive, and the law firm had existed for half a century, serving the wealthiest people in the state. I called my children. My son Tommy, who works in IT, laughed at first, then got scared. He said it sounded like a money laundering trap or tax scheme. My daughter Emily, who works in marketing, suggested I'd been randomly selected from a database for some kind of scam. But why me specifically? I'm the most ordinary woman imaginable. I worked as a nurse for 40 years, raised 2 children, recently became a grandmother. I live in a modest house in the suburbs, drive a 10-year-old car, buy clothes on sale. What could possibly interest a millionaire about me? 3 days later, I sat in the luxurious office of attorney David Harrison. The gray-haired, elegant man in his 60s greeted me with professional politeness, but I noticed how carefully he studied my face, as if looking for something familiar. Harrison explained that Mr. Collins had written his will 2 years ago and never changed it since. I was listed as the sole heir to his entire fortune. There were no other claimants, relatives, or business partners who could contest the will. When I asked where Robert Collins could have gotten my information and why he chose me specifically, the attorney became noticeably tense. He said only that the deceased client had mentioned an important reason, but hadn't revealed details. Harrison had received instructions to simply execute the deceased's wishes without asking unnecessary questions. Walking out of the office with documents for $5 million, a mansion, and a construction empire, I felt like I was in a nightmare. This couldn't be happening to me. These things happen in movies, not in the real life of a simple suburban nurse. At home, I immediately went online. There was plenty of information about Robert Collins. He owned the state's largest construction company, which had operated for 40 years. He'd built half the shopping centers and residential complexes in the city. A bachelor who never had children. His parents were already gone. He died of a massive heart attack a month ago at age 79. His photos in business magazines showed a tall, elegant man with penetrating gray eyes and noble features. Something about that face seemed strangely familiar, but I couldn't figure out what exactly. Maybe he just resembled someone I knew or some actor. The next morning, I decided to visit his company's office. If he somehow knew about me, maybe employees would remember something or explain this mystery. The main office of Collins Construction. was located in a 40-story skyscraper in the business district. A luxurious marble lobby, expensive furniture, paintings by famous artists. A world I'd never been part of. The receptionist, an elegant woman in her 50s, greeted me with a professional smile. When I introduced myself and explained the inheritance situation, her eyes widened in surprise. She said she'd never heard my name from the late boss and suggested I speak with his personal assistant. Mr. Collins's personal secretary, a woman named Margaret, had worked with him for 25 years. She was reserved and cautious with her words, but I sensed she was hiding something. Margaret confirmed she'd never heard my name in connection with company business or the boss's personal life. But when I asked if Mr. Collins had any special interests or hobbies that might explain his decision, Margaret paused thoughtfully. She said the boss was a very secretive man who never talked about his personal life. But in recent years, he often stayed late in the office evenings, studying something in his office. I asked to see the deceased's office, a spacious room with panoramic windows, a massive oak desk, leather chairs, and bookshelves. There were no personal items or photographs on the desk. Everything looked sterile and impersonal. But Margaret mentioned that Mr. Collins had a personal safe in his office, which he accessed every evening before leaving. She didn't know what was stored there. Only he knew the combination. A safe. That's where the answers to my questions might be. The next few days, I spent trying to find any connection between my family and Robert Collins. I questioned relatives, studied family documents, searched online for any mention of our surname in connection with his company. My father, Jim, died 3 years ago, never learning about this mystery. My mother, Mary, died 5 years ago from cancer. My older brother, Michael, worked as a mechanic his whole life. My younger sister, Jennifer, was a teacher. None of us had ever dealt with the construction business or big money. But after a week of searching, I stumbled upon the first clue. In my mother's old documents, which I'd kept after her death, I found an employment certificate. In 1965, before I was born, my mother had worked for 3 months as a secretary at some construction company. I carefully studied the document. The company name, Collins Construction. That same Robert Collins had been her boss 58 years ago. My heart started pounding. Finally, some connection. But 3 months of work, almost 60 years ago, wasn't reason to leave someone $5 million, especially since my mother worked there before I was even born. Or was it? I returned to Margaret with this new information. I told her that my mother had once worked at the company. The secretary frowned, trying to remember something, but shook her head. It was too long ago, and she hadn't worked there then, but she agreed to show me Mr. Collins's house, which now also belonged to me. Maybe I'd find answers there. The mansion in the elite suburb amazed me with its size. A 3-story house with 10 bedrooms, a library, wine cellar, home theater, and swimming pool. The furnishings were expensive but austere. No personal items, family photos, or objects that would tell you about the owner's character. The house felt like a museum, not a place where someone had lived. Too perfect, too impersonal. As if Robert Collins was afraid to leave traces of his personality. I spent the entire day in the house, examining every room. In the first-floor study, I discovered another safe built into the wall behind a painting. A massive steel box with an electronic lock. No way to get in without the code. What code could a man who left no personal traces choose? His birthday? But I didn't know the exact date. The company's founding date. His parents' death dates? I tried several obvious options. Nothing worked. The safe remained locked, guarding its secrets. But then it hit me. What if the code was connected not to his life, but to mine? After all, he'd left me his entire fortune. Maybe the code was my birth date. With trembling fingers, I entered the numbers, day, month, and year of my birth. The safe clicked and opened. Why was my birthday the code to his personal safe? Inside were neatly sorted folders, photographs, and documents. The first folder had my name written on it. Others had dates by year, starting from 1966, the year I was born. I opened the first folder and nearly fainted from shock. Inside were photographs of me at different ages, not family snapshots that parents take, but shots taken from a distance, secretly. Me in a stroller, in kindergarten, in a school uniform, at graduation, in a wedding dress, with newborn children. Someone had been watching me my entire life, photographing every important moment without showing themselves. The folders contained documents that made me doubt the reality of what was happening. My school grades, medical records, work information, addresses of every place I'd lived, even copies of divorce documents from my first husband. How could a stranger have all the information about my life? In a separate folder were private detective reports, hundreds of pages of observations of me and my family. Starting from 1966 until last year, every month the detective sent detailed reports about what we were doing, where we worked, how we felt, what our plans were. Robert Collins paid a private investigator huge amounts of money to know every step of my life. Almost 60 years of total surveillance. But why? What interest could I possibly represent to a wealthy businessman? The thickest folder contained financial documents, bank transfers, receipts, charity agreements. And that's when I understood the scale of what was happening. All the random strokes of luck in our family's life were at random. Behind each one was the generous hand of Robert Collins. In 1995, when I was 29, my parents' mortgage was suddenly paid off completely. The documents showed a receipt. The money was transferred by an anonymous charitable foundation, which turned out to be Robert's shell organization. My medical college education was paid for by an educational fund for capable students from working families. Full scholarship plus dormitory and meals. The documents included a copy of the application I'd submitted, with Robert's note, "Approve immediately." When Dad Jim lost his job in the 2008 crisis, his pension savings mysteriously tripled. In the folder was a check from Robert to the pension fund with instructions to credit Jim Miller's account as profit from successful investments. The first apartment my first husband and I bought as newlyweds cost a third of market value. The seller had said then that he wanted to help the young family. Now I knew the truth. Robert had paid the difference from his own money. My son's expensive treatment after the car accident, private schools for the children, summer camps, music lessons. Behind all of this were the funds of a man I thought was a stranger. Even my easy divorce from my first husband was orchestrated. The folder contained a receipt for paying my ex-husband's lawyer's services. Robert had paid him to agree to my terms without disputes. 58 years of my life had been secretly controlled and directed by an invisible hand. I thought I was making my own decisions, building my destiny, dealing with difficulties myself. But in reality, I had a secret patron who solved my problems with one movement of his checkbook. But why? What was the reason for such incredible care for a stranger's family? I found the private detective's business card, James Parker. The phone number was active. The elderly man agreed to meet, though reluctantly. We met at a cafe downtown. James Parker turned out to be a thin, elderly man of about 85 with attentive but tired eyes of a professional observer. He was nervous and clearly didn't want to discuss this topic. Parker confirmed that he'd worked for Robert Collins for almost 60 years. His job was to monitor my family and provide detailed reports about our lives. He didn't track anyone else for Robert, only us. When I asked why this was necessary, the detective hesitated. He said Robert never explained his motives, just paid and demanded the most detailed information possible. He was especially interested in my health, education, career, personal life. But then Parker added a phrase that made me alert. He said, Robert didn't treat these reports like a businessman reviewing business summaries, but like a father reading information about his daughter. He wouldn't study data about a stranger with such love and anxiety. Like a father reading information about his daughter. Those words echoed in my head the entire drive home. Could Robert Collins have been my biological father? But that seemed impossible. My father was Jim Miller, who raised me from birth, loved me unconditionally, was proud of every achievement I made, who called me his princess and cared for me until his last day of life. However, the facts were forming a frightening picture. My mother had worked for Robert 9 months before I was born. He knew my birthday so well that he made it the code for his safe. 60 years of secret care for my destiny. I returned to studying the documents from the safe, looking for confirmation or refutation of this terrible suspicion. In one of the folders, I found Robert's medical records from different years. Most were routine, test results, doctor's conclusions. But one record made me freeze. It contained a diagnosis, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, type 3, a rare genetic disease that occurs in 1 person out of 5,000. The main symptom is joint hypermobility, the ability to bend fingers and limbs in unnatural positions. I'd had exactly the same condition since childhood. I could turn my fingers inside out, bend my arms backward at the elbows, sit in poses that were impossible for other people. My parents and doctors said it was just increased flexibility, nothing serious. But Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is hereditary. It's passed genetically from parents to children. If Robert had this syndrome, and I did too, then we were definitely related. Jim and my mother never had joint problems. They didn't have the kind of flexibility I had. The medical coincidence couldn't be accidental. I called James Parker and insisted on another meeting. This time, I was prepared to demand the complete truth, no matter how painful it might be. The detective came even more worried than last time. Apparently, he understood that the secret he'd kept his entire life was about to be revealed. I told him about the medical documents and the matching diagnoses. Parker listened silently, then sighed heavily. He said he'd always known that sooner or later the truth would surface. And then he told me a story that turned my entire understanding of family upside down. In 1965, my mother, Mary, worked as a secretary at Robert Collins's company. She was married to Jim. They already had a 1-year-old son, Michael. The family lived modestly, but happily. Robert fell in love with my mother at first sight. He was 12 years older, single, successful, and wealthy. He began actively courting her, suggesting she leave her husband, promising to provide for her and her son with everything necessary. But my mother loved Jim. She rejected Robert's attempts to win her over to his side, asked him to leave their family alone. Robert didn't give up, but my mother was inflexible. However, the Miller family was going through a difficult period at that time. Jim had returned from the army with psychological problems, drank heavily. There were scandals. My mother was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, didn't know how to save the marriage and protect her little son. At the end of 1965, at the company's New Year's party, my mother was particularly upset. The day before, she and Jim had had a serious conflict. She'd even thought about divorce. She drank more than usual, broke down crying from despair. Robert comforted her, offered help and support. That evening, intimacy occurred between them, the only time during their entire acquaintance. A month later, my mother realized she was pregnant. She didn't know exactly whose child it was, her husband's or Robert's. But by then, the relationship with Jim had improved. He'd stopped drinking. They were happy again. My mother wanted to have an abortion so as not to risk family well-being. But Robert found out about the pregnancy and begged her not to kill the child. He proposed a deal. If my mother carried and gave birth to the baby, he promised never to interfere in their lives or claim rights to the child. Robert gave his word that his daughter would never see him, never know of his existence. But in return, he asked for the right to know how his child was growing and to help the family in difficult moments. My mother agreed. When I was born, it became clear that I didn't look like Jim. But he was so happy to become a father for the second time that he didn't pay attention to appearance. He loved me like his own daughter, and for him, I was exactly that. Robert kept his word. He never appeared in our lives openly, never tried to meet or claim his rights. But through a private detective, he monitored my every step and secretly helped the family whenever we needed support. My mother knew about this help, but pretended it was random luck or bake errors. Jim never learned the truth. He died considering me his blood daughter. Parker fell silent, giving me time to digest what I'd heard. I sat in deafening silence, trying to comprehend the scale of the revealed truth. I had two fathers. One raised me and gave me his love, surname, and upbringing. The other protected me from the shadows and provided me with a secure future. Jim was the father of my heart. Robert was the father of my blood. Both loved me in their own way. One was nearby, the other at a distance. One gave advice and hugs, the other gave opportunities and protection. I asked Parker why Robert never married or had other children. The detective answered that Robert loved my mother his entire life. After I was born, he still hoped for several years that she would change her mind and choose him. But when he realized this wouldn't happen, he accepted the role of secret father and decided never to love anyone else again. His entire life, all his love, he devoted to a daughter he couldn't call his daughter. Now I needed scientific confirmation of what I'd learned. A DNA test would finally dot all the I's. I took hair samples from Robert's house and submitted them along with my analysis to a laboratory. The result came a week later. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Robert Collins truly was my biological father. I sat for a long time with the test results in my hands, trying to get used to the new reality. My entire life, I'd had a father who loved me from afar, who sacrificed his happiness for my well-being, who chose silence and loneliness just so I could grow up in a complete family. Robert Collins lived the life of a secret hero. He saved my family from financial problems without revealing his name. He helped me get an education and build a career while staying in the shadows. He protected me from troubles without claiming gratitude. He was a father who loved so strongly that he agreed not to be a father officially. The $5 million he left me wasn't just money. It was concentrated paternal love, accumulated over 60 years. Love that didn't demand recognition, didn't wait for hugs, didn't ask to be called dad. I went to the cemetery to Robert's grave, a simple black headstone with a laconic inscription. Robert Collins, 1944 to 2023, loving father. Now I understood who those words were meant for. I placed a bouquet of white roses, the same ones he brought to my mother's grave every week. And for the first time in my life, I spoke words he never heard while alive. Thank you, Dad, for everything. In the following days, I told my children the truth. Tommy and Emily were shocked, but understood the magnitude of the sacrifice their grandfather had made. They decided to name future children after Robert. Let his name continue to live in the family he protected his entire life. I often think about how courageous a person must be to give up the right to be a father for the sake of a child's happiness. Robert could have destroyed our family, demanded recognition, sued for rights to meet with me. He could have hurt my mother, Jim, destroyed Michael's childhood and my future. But he chose silence. He chose love without conditions, without demands, without expecting gratitude. Every day, for 60 years, he fought the desire to approach, hug, say he was proud of me. Every holiday he spent alone, knowing his daughter was celebrating with another family. Every achievement of mine he met with joy he couldn't share with anyone. But he endured, because my happiness was more important to him than his own. Now I understand where I got some personality traits that weren't characteristic of my parents. Persistence in achieving goals, ability to make difficult decisions, capacity to sacrifice my interests for loved ones. This was inheritance from Robert, not just financial, but genetic. Studying documents from his safe, I learned many more amazing details of his secret care. When I was 12 and dreamed of a dog, but my parents couldn't afford such luxury, a homeless puppy suddenly appeared in our yard. It turned out Robert had bought a purebred dog and left it at our house, first making sure through the detective that we would take it. When as a teenager I liked a boy from a wealthy family who treated me badly, this boy unexpectedly moved to another city. His father got a lucrative job offer from Robert's company. When I was choosing between several universities, the one considered best for medical education suddenly had a special scholarship for students with my parameters. Robert created it specifically for me. Even my first marriage wasn't coincidental. The detective carefully studied my future husband's reputation and character, and only after receiving a positive assessment did Robert accidentally arrange our meeting through mutual acquaintances. When the marriage began falling apart due to my husband's infidelity, Robert didn't interfere directly, but provided me with the best lawyer and financial independence for a painless divorce. Every important decision in my life wasn't made by me alone. I had an invisible advisor who directed events so I would choose the best path. Robert studied child psychology to understand how to properly help me at different stages of development. He consulted with educators about upbringing methods. He read medical literature to monitor my health. He was a father who never held me in his arms, but knew more about me than I knew myself, who couldn't read me bedtime stories, but provided me with the best education, who didn't walk me to school, but created conditions for my success. In his house, I found a room that no one had ever seen. Margaret told me that Mr. Collins categorically forbade anyone, even the cleaning lady, from entering. Now I understood why. It was my room, a room for a daughter who never lived there. The walls were covered with my photographs from birth to recent years. On the shelves stood gifts he bought me for every birthday, but never gave. Dolls, books, jewelry, electronics. Everything a loving father might have given. In the corner stood a desk with notebooks that he recorded his thoughts about my life. Page after page of paternal experiences he couldn't share with anyone. Susan started first grade today. I want to buy her a beautiful backpack, but I can't. Jim should be the one buying school supplies for his daughter. Susan got strep throat. The detective reported her temperature is high. I want to come, sit by her bed, but I have no right. I'm transferring money for the best medicine. Susan fell in love with a classmate. The detective checked the boy, good kid from a decent family. I'm glad she has good taste in people. Susan is getting married, the happiest and most painful day of my life. I want to walk her down the aisle, but that right belongs to Jim. I'll watch from afar. 60 years of paternal records. 60 years of love that couldn't be expressed openly. In the last entry, made a week before his death, he wrote, "Doctors say there's little time left. I don't regret anything." Susan grew up to be a wonderful woman, raised remarkable children, became a grandmother. My life wasn't in vain. I gave her everything I could while staying in the shadows. Now she can learn the truth and understand that she was always loved. Reading these lines, I cried not from pity, but from gratitude. Robert Collins lived one of the most beautiful love stories I know. The love of a father for his daughter, love without conditions or demands. I used the inheritance money to create a charitable foundation in Robert Collins's name. Scholarships for medical students from low-income families, help for single mothers, support for children from broken homes. Let his kindness continue to live, helping those who need support, as my family once needed it. Every month, I visit the cemetery with white roses, first to my mother, then to Robert. I tell them about my grandchildren, about the foundation's work, about how grateful I am to both of them for the life they gave me. My mother gave me family and upbringing. Robert gave me protection and opportunities. Jim gave me unconditional love and self-respect. All three sacrificed something important for my happiness. My mother sacrificed honesty, keeping the secret her entire life. Jim sacrificed the right to know the truth, but got a loving daughter in return. Robert sacrificed the right to be a father, but preserved my childhood. The story of my birth could have destroyed 3 lives. But the wisdom of 3 adults turned potential tragedy into a story about true love. Now I tell this story to my grandchildren, about how real love doesn't always shout about itself. Sometimes it acts in silence, not expecting gratitude, about how family isn't just blood relation, but the choice to protect and care for each other, about how each of us might have a guardian angel whose existence we don't even suspect. Robert Collins remained a stranger to the entire world, but became the most important person in my life. A father who loved so strongly that he chose to remain in the shadows. A man who proved that true parental love isn't measured by time spent together, but by willingness to sacrifice oneself for a child's happiness. The $5 million inheritance wasn't just money. It was materialized paternal love accumulated over 60 years. Love that patiently waited for its moment to finally say, "I was always nearby. I always loved you." And now that I know the truth, I'm proud to have been the daughter of 2 remarkable men. Jim, who gave me a name, upbringing, and sense of security. And Robert, who gave me life, opportunities, and a future. Both were my fathers, each in his own way. And I'm grateful to fate for receiving a double portion of paternal love. Robert Collins's story taught me the main thing. Sometimes the most important people in our lives remain invisible. They don't demand recognition, don't wait for gratitude. They simply love and protect, staying in the shadows. There are no strangers. There are only angels we haven't recognized yet.